Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 2, From Kingdom to Duchy. Today we continue our prologue by covering Burgundy under the Merovingian and Carolingian monarchies. We will be speeding through the narrative relative to last episode, as otherwise this episode would likely be split into 4, and filled with names and events that are mostly irrelevant to our main story. So today I'd like to mainly focus on some of the big events of the period and the themes that will carry over into the narrative. Now, if you pick up any given book on Burgundy, the chapter covering this time period will likely also be named From Kingdom to Duchy. I'll admit I spent some time trying to come up with a better or at least different name for this episode, but in the end I decided to go with convention. We ended our first episode with the absorption of Burgundia into Francia, and although this was the end of the kingdom of the Burgundians that we had grown so fond of, it was not the end of a kingdom bearing the name Burgundy. After the death of Clothair, the conqueror of Burgundy, more or less the entire kingdom as it was under Godemar's family was given to one of his sons, and the rest of the kingdom of the Franks was split between the others. Burgundy would spend some time over the course of Merovingian Francia, both as an independent kingdom and as a component part. Its rulers took place in raids and wars both outside of Francia and with the other rulers of it. A lot happened over the 200 years or so that the Merovingians ruled Burgundy, but much of it doesn't have any effect on the course of Valois Burgundy some 600 years later. If you are interested in a play-by-play of this period of Frankish history, and it's quite interesting, I highly recommend the series Thugs and Miracles. So, in lieu of going through the period between Godemar and Robert I, the first Capetian Duke of Burgundy, with a fine-toothed comb, I am choosing to zone out and look at Francia as a whole, and what are, in my opinion, some of its defining moments in that period. While the first part of this episode may technically be about the Merovingian dynasty, it was the Carolingians, also sometimes known as the Pepinids, that really drove the narrative. To get a feel for this dynamic, I'd like to quote one of France's more famous historians, François Guizot, a man who himself earned a place in the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto for his own power behind the monarchy of King Louis Philippe. Quote, "There is a certain amount of sound sense, of intelligent activity and practical efficiency, which even the least civilized and least exacting communities absolutely must look for in their governing body. When this necessary share of ability and influence of a political kind are decidedly wanting in the men who have the titles and the official posts of power, communities seek elsewhere the qualities which they cannot do without." Guizot was, of course, talking here about the Merovingians and the Pepinids. While the first third or so of the Merovingian dynasty was defined by strong kings leading battles both against non-Frankish enemies and each other, the latter part was defined by weak kings being led around by powerful nobles. Despite getting off to a strong start, the power of the Merovingian kings had diminished greatly by the 150th anniversary of Clovis's death, and this trend would only increase as time went on. This was partly due to the entropic nature of Salic inheritance. The frequent civil wars made it necessary for the kings of Austrasia, Neustria, Burgundy, and Aquitaine, and the other units that infrequently popped into being, to grant large concessions to the local magnates for their support. Additionally, when the kings were off waging war, again, often with each other, they left care of the political aspect of their kingdoms to the mayors of the palace, who took every opportunity to empower themselves at the expense of the kings. Even when Francia was united, this process could not simply be undone by a strong and capable king, something that Louis XI would learn from the revolt of the public weal later in our story. It is also worth noting that not all of the later Merovingian kings were strong and capable. Many came to the throne as children or did not rule for very long. In short, the ability of the kings to rule was slowly but surely being siphoned away by their chief lieutenants. This process is best illustrated by the Battle of Tertry in 687. It should be noted that the belligerents, Austrasia on one side and Neustria and Burgundy on the other, were all technically ruled by the same king at the time. This battle was the culmination of a war run by the mayors of the palaces of Austrasia and Neustria. The winner of the battle was the Austrasian mayor Pepin de Herstal. Pepin did not take his victory as an opportunity to proclaim himself king, but rather to further the process of chipping away the power of the monarchy. Tertry showcased the impotence of the Merovingian king and cemented the Pepinids as the true rulers of the Frankish domain. The Battle of Tertry ended up providing some stability at the top for Francia. While the previous century and a half had been defined by kings and their mayors fighting each other, the next century and a half would see the kingdom firmly and not so firmly under the control of the Pepinids. This is not to say that rebellions, civil war, and invasion did not occur, but rather we don't see kings leading armies against their brother kings in protracted wars in the same way and scale until the reigns of the grandsons of Charlemagne in the 840s. The next big battle that shaped Merovingian Francia was the Second Battle of Poitiers, also known as the Battle of Tours. As a quick aside, the First Battle of Poitiers, also known as the Battle of Vouilly, was a decisive part of the Pan-German War that I mentioned last time, and the Third Battle of Poitiers will be a big reason that the main narrative even gets off the ground in the first place. History might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. But back to the Battle of Tours. In the 100 years since the death of Muhammad, the Islamic Caliphate had truly exploded onto the world scene, becoming the power in the Mediterranean and West Asian spheres. The Caliphate, in 732, was ruled by the Umayyads, and had spent the last 20 years gobbling up the Visigothic kingdom of Spain. In that regard, they were similar to the Merovingians, who had pressured Visigothic Spain from the west and north for centuries. However, now with the Visigothic buffer collapsed, the two powers on either side were about to meet. The Caliphate had sent raiding parties into Frankish territory over the past few years, and a full-scale invasion was inevitable. Charles Martell, the mayor of the palace and son of Pepin de Herstal, gathered the strength of Francia in order to resist the rising tide of Islam. In a long and bloody battle, the Franks, with a significant Burgundian company I might add, were able to defeat the Umayyads. While the Franks did not have the ability, or even the desire, to drive the Umayyads out of Spain, they did halt the advance of Islam into Europe, at least from the west. For his victory, Charles Martel gained two important things. The first was the submission of the autonomous region of Aquitaine, on whose behalf Martel fought, and the second was the further strengthening of his already strong position within Francia. A third thing he gained was the surname Martel, or Hammer, for the way he swung his battle axe during the fighting. Charles Martel, by adding Aquitaine to his suzerainty, controlled all of Francia, at least in name. He would spend the next few years solidifying control in the face of near-constant revolt and civil war. Much of the time was spent in Burgundy, where independent-minded nobles were legion. Charles made some key alliances with certain powerful nobles, and it was them, more so than him, that brought Burgundy solidly into Martel's orbit. When the Merovingian king, Theuderic IV, died in 737, Martel did not bother to appoint a successor. After decades of the mayors of the palace slowly chipping away at royal power, Charles Martel was the one strong enough to hold it in his own right. This was largely due to his vast network of vassals that stretched throughout Francia. In fact, the system of feudalism, which can trace its origins to the Roman client-patron relationships, seems to reach maturity with Charles Martel ruling due to relationships with his vassals. That being said, I can hear one of my professors emphatically saying that we should not treat feudalism as a system, and that it never really existed as we tend to see it today. But even if feudalism itself is not a system, the way that, say, capitalism exists as a system, the feudal relationships that take hold during this period and develop over the next few centuries are critical to understanding the social fabric of late medieval Europe that Valois Burgundy existed in. So, before we reach Charlemagne, a man who needs no introduction, let's talk about the structure of Frankish society. Society in Western Christendom during this period was roughly divided into three orders: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. And it is in this division that we see the origins of the three estates of the Estates General. Feudalism is, in its most basic form, the hierarchical networks of patronage and vassalage that exist within the second group. These networks were held together by homage, where a vassal pledges loyalty to his lord and in exchange is granted usually a fief or rights to something like charging tolls on a bridge or mill. The vassal then owed the lord assistance in court and in battle. And while this is a massive simplification of the customs that varied over the years from place to place, these networks of vassals and suzerains dominated European society for over 1,000 years. Initially, when a vassal died, their fief reverted back to the lord, but over time, land and rights given by the lord began to remain in the vassal's family. As vassals began to view their fiefs as their own rather than as a lease from their lords, their ambitions would grow, and as our story goes along, we'll see many examples of rebellious vassals, whose rebellions are often centered around conflicting views on rights. But this only has to do with the bellatores, those who fight. What about the clergy, also known as the oratores, those who pray, and the peasants, the laboratores, those who work? The peasants were at the bottom of the feudal pyramid, if they were ever included in it at all. They made no homage, rather they worked their land and owed taxes or corvée labor to their lord. In exchange for their submission, they received protection, although the protection was often inadequate when armies or bandits rolled through the area. And, more often than not, their primary threat came from a cruel or greedy local lord. If the peasants existed at the bottom of the rigidly hierarchical medieval society, the clergy existed parallel to it. At the bottom were the local priests, who often came from peasant origin themselves. These priests lived off tithes from the community and could either lead relatively, keyword relatively, easy lives, or could live in just as much squalor as the rest of the community they served. Higher up in the church were cathedral canons who ran larger churches, and above them, bishops. These clerics were almost always drawn from the younger sons of the nobility, and many of them held title to noble rights in their own right. The bishops were powerful figures who, in addition to whatever rights they held personally, usually had many rights over the city in which they served due to their role. Often, they were the de facto or even de jure head of the city. The Merovingian and Carolingian period also saw a rise of monasticism. Although this trend would really take off in post-Carolingian Europe, in this period, monasteries were still a force to be reckoned with. Monasticism, as we think of it, truly began with the rule of Saint Benedict, which was written shortly after the death of Clovis. During this period, many lords decided that the best way to make sure that their souls reached heaven after a lifetime spent in bloody conflict was to give gifts to or found monasteries, and monasteries quickly became some of the richest and most prosperous places in a sea of toiling peasants. It is at this time that the trope of the fat monk finds its origins. Not everyone was satisfied with the way that monasticism was going, and towards the end of the Carolingian period, a wave of reform was beginning to sweep Western Christendom. This wave would culminate with the Cluniac and Cistercian reforms to monastic life, both movements getting their name from abbeys in Burgundy. One group that so far has been entirely ignored were the burghers, or the men of the town. This is because these men made up a small minority of early medieval society. It should be mentioned that even now, Flanders was one of the most urbanized areas in Europe, although the county was still primarily rural. However, towns were most definitely on the rise, and over the course of our story will come to play a dominant role. Town communes would jealously guard their rights, and over time, as they became more powerful, they would begin to flex their power. In fact, it is the men of the towns that would eventually bring down Charles the Bold. Another group that has been, if not entirely ignored, at least they have not been mentioned outright, were women. Women existed in every group mentioned previously, and even if a woman could not be a priest, she could still join a convent as a nun, and their experiences were just as varied as men's were. However, the society was extremely patriarchal, and while individual women could wield enormous power and influence, as a group, women were generally subordinated to their husbands or fathers. The lack of social influence that women have is compounded by most chroniclers' disinterest in writing about them. So while I believe that women played a far greater role in history than was traditionally written down, in the primary sources they are usually mentioned and little else. I will have much more to say about the structure of society and its evolution as history moves forward. And during the reign of the Capetians, society will continue to evolve closer to the form it will take at the beginning of our narrative proper. But in order to make it from here to there, we will need to talk about the Carolingians. When Charles Martell died, he left control of Francia to his sons Pepin and Carloman. After some years of ruling behind a Merovingian king who had been appointed by the brothers in the wake of their father's death, Pepin, now in sole control of the kingdom, decided to do away with the last Merovingian and assume the throne for himself. This was not done in some bloody civil war like the Year of the Four Emperors or the more recent Merovingian conquest of Burgundy. That was already handled at Tertry over 60 years earlier, but rather by simply announcing that it was so, and helping the Pope in Rome's struggle with the Lombards in exchange for his blessing. After almost 3 decades as master of Francia, 17 of which as the first Carolingian king, Pepin left the crown to his sons, Charles, and, mirroring his own experience, Carloman. However, it wouldn't be long until Charles alone reigned as king. The brothers didn't actually go to war, although it was close. Carloman conveniently died and made way for his brother to shape history. Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, is one of the most recognizable figures that will be mentioned on the podcast, and is quite possibly the most recognizable. However, other than being mentioned, Charlemagne himself didn't do much to set the stage for the rise of Burgundy. So, as important as Charlemagne was to the development of Western Europe, we are more interested in the reigns and wars of his grandsons and their descendants. It is in the splitting of Charlemagne's empire that we see the origins of Lotharingia, the second state whose legacy would be carried on by Valois Burgundy. The reigns of Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious were an era of centralization and stabilization, but much of this is due to Charlemagne's good sense to outlive all but one of his sons. When Louis died, he followed the Salic tradition of splitting his lands between his 3 sons. During his lifetime, Louis had attempted to cut kingdoms out of the empire for his sons, so that each could keep their standing while maintaining the empire as a single unit. But revolts by those sons had shaken Francia and even overthrown Louis for some time, forcing him to redraw his sons' boundaries on occasion. When he died in 840, he passed the majority of the empire, along with the imperial title, to his oldest son Lothar, and smaller kingdoms for his sons Charles the Bald and Louis the German. However, Charles and Louis the German refused to acknowledge their brother Lothar's suzerainty over them, and so the two teamed up against their older brother in a civil war. Their victory over Lothar caused the title of emperor to become largely symbolic for the remainder of the lifetime of the Carolingian family, although it was still a coveted symbol, and led to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Verdun split Francia into 3 parts. West Francia, roughly 2/3 of modern France from the Atlantic to the Meuse, the Saône, and the Rhone rivers, went to Charles the Bald. East Francia, all of the Frankish lands east of the Rhine River and north of the Alps, went to Louis the German. And Middle Francia, the lands bounded by the aforementioned rivers with the addition of the Low Countries north of the Rhine and northern Italy, went to Lothar. It is here that we see the splitting of Burgundy from one of the kingdoms of Merovingian Francia into the Duchy of Burgundy, which was a part of West Francia, and the County of Burgundy, a part of Middle Francia. Despite 3 years of war, the loss of the centralizing power of the emperor, and the ever-increasing estrangement of the branches of the House of Charles Martell, the rulers of Francia, or at least the royal propagandists, still considered the empire to be united. Even if Charles and Louis did not want to be a part of Lothar's hierarchy, the prestige of being rulers of part of the Roman Empire was greater than being kings of mere kingdoms. And besides, Francia had been split between different Merovingian kings in the past. Why should this split be any more permanent? But as time went on, it appeared that entropy would dominate, and Francia would never truly reunite. Upon Lothar's death, his territory would be divided further. Italy and the imperial title would go to his oldest son, and Provence would go to his youngest. The rest of his lands would go to Lothar II. These lands were creatively known as Lotharingia, or the lands of Lothar. Lotharingia would not last long, as Lothar II would die childless. Well, kind of. There was an illegitimate son that Lothar's uncles conveniently ignored. Louis the German and Charles the Bald decided to cut out both Lothar's son and brothers from any division of lands that might occur. They split Lotharingia between them, with Louis taking most of it. After a decade and more wars between the Carolingian princes, the remainder of Lotharingia was eventually ceded to East Francia. But this did not mark the end of East and West Francia and their successor kingdoms' attempts to snatch Lotharingia from each other. During this period, we also see the rise of the Vikings. This, of course, meant that control of the northern parts of Lotharingia was more theoretical than practical. But as one of the most threatening elements to the Vikings were their ability to sail inland via rivers on their longboats, the portion of Burgundy in West Francia, despite being far from the coast, was not immune to their raids. It is during these Viking raids that we meet our first Duke of Burgundy. Richard the Justiciar started his career in the backdrop of his brother Boso's attempt to carve out a kingdom for himself in Provence and the lands of the county of Burgundy. Boso was elected king by the local nobles in opposition to the Carolingian princes and as a way to ensure their local rights. Richard, however, remained loyal to the Carolingians and usurped his brother's role of Count of Autun and steadily expanded his territory until he was eventually able to bring his brother down where the Carolingian princes had failed. After defeating his brother, Richard continued to expand his territory. He was rewarded for his loyalty to the royal house and granted several fiefs for his service. He was also able to carve out land from the remains of his brother's kingdom, as well as neighboring territories. By the time of his death, Richard controlled almost all the lands that would later make up the Duchy of Burgundy. Much of Richard's reputation came from his ability to defeat Vikings. It is, after all, what led to his cognomen. He was able to make Burgundy a relatively safe haven for monks fleeing Viking raids and the relics they carried with them. This, of course, would lead Burgundy to being one of the centers of monasticism. Later in his life, Richard claimed the title Duke of Burgundy. It should be noted that, at this point, the Duchy of Burgundy was more a collection of territories than a single administrative unit, so this title should mainly be understood as a signifier of his role in the region of Burgundy. This period is also when the office of duke was beginning to change in nature. Earlier, the dukedom was understood to be a beneficiary office, or an office that was granted by a suzerain to a vassal. But, as mentioned earlier, as dukes became more powerful, and as the kings began to lose their power, the dukes began to leave their offices to their children. In 877, Charles the Bald, now emperor of all of Francia, if not direct ruler of all of it, issued a capitulation that allowed his magnates to pass their lands to their children. Although his decree did stipulate that the sovereign maintained the right to actually confer the land, this right became more or less honorary not long after it was decreed. And so, upon his death in 921, Richard the Justiciar left Burgundy to his son Rudolf. Rudolf got himself caught up in the struggles between the Carolingians and the Robertonians for control of the kingdom of West Francia, and after the death of King Robert I, his father-in-law, Rudolf found himself king, and passed Burgundy to his brother Hugh the Black. When Rudolf died, the crown of West Francia fell back to the Carolingians, but despite not being king, the patriarch of the Robertonian family, Hugh the Great, took this opportunity to grow his own power and influence. Here we see a parallel to the Merovingians and the Pepinids, as the Robertonians would later become the Capetians. One of the places that the Robertonians looked to grow their power was in Burgundy. After Hugh the Black refused to acknowledge the new Carolingian king, perhaps hoping to be the one to replace his brother on the throne, Hugh the Great put himself in the services of the royal house and in exchange was able to wrest half the duchy from Hugh's control. Upon the death of Hugh the Black, Hugh the Great was able to become suzerain of Gilbert, the new duke of the other half of Burgundy. Hugh the Great was survived by 3 sons, the most famous of which was Hugh Capet, the man who would finally take West Francia away from the Carolingians for good, and it is with the accession of Hugh Capet that I will finally begin to use the term France. Hugh's other 2 sons would each rule as Duke of Burgundy. After the death of Hugh the Great's first son Otto and second son Henry, Henry's stepson, Otto William, would claim the mantle of Duke of Burgundy. He would also inherit the county of Burgundy from his mother, uniting the 2 Burgundys briefly. Unfortunately for Otto William, his step-cousin, King Robert II of France, was determined to be his uncle's heir. Over the next few years, the 2 would wage war until Robert seized the Duchy of Burgundy, leaving Otto William with the county. It is interesting to think what would have happened if Otto William had won the war with his cousin. Due to how the Treaty of Verdun and the subsequent partitions of Lotharingia shook out, the county of Burgundy lay within the still in the process of forming German Empire, while the duchy lay within France. If Robert had failed and the 2 Burgundys had remained united, we might have seen a united Burgundy totally within the German Empire, or within France. At the very least, the story of Valois Burgundy would be very different if the dukes had received one political unit under one sovereign. But for now, we will leave Burgundy in a similar place as we left Burgundia last week, annexed by the ruler of France. Next week, we will once again see Burgundy separate from the royal domain, however, this time as a duchy rather than as a kingdom. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this show, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it 5 stars on your platform of choice and tell your friends about it. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me on twitter.com/ValoisBurgundy or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com.